hello Luciano, this is good to have you in Paris. You've been here for quite a while, but that's 5 years ago now, or 4 years ago.
Yes.
And now you're a professor at the University of Quilmes in Argentina, and also a researcher at CONICET. My first question is very simple, very general. You've been working, you did your PhD on Hobbes and questions related to authority. You are still working on the question of authority. Why do you think it's important nowadays as a philosopher to work on this topic?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. And well, I think this is a topic that has relevance. I think when we think about authority in general, I think we relate the idea to the authority of the state. So we as citizens, how the issue would be, what's our relationship with the state, especially the moral claims the states, or our states perhaps, make on us. So what's exactly the reasons that we have to obey the state, if there are any. So the authority of the state and the political obligation of the citizen in general traditionally are viewed as two sides of the same coin. So they are related, and I think this is central. But also to understand the authority of the state, we have to understand the concept of authority in general, I think. And so the analytic work on the idea of authority is very important.
In the paper you're going to present at the seminar,
yes.
You're not talking so much about the state, but
yes.
the example you're referring to is also is interesting because it concerns the relationship between doctors and nurses.
Yes.
So what does it change when you go from the state, authority within the state, to questions related to authority in other domains?
Yes, well, that's a very interesting, I think, a crucial question, perhaps, because I think when we think of relationships of authority between, like, a professional, like a doctor and a nurse, or a teacher and a student, or a parent and a children, the relationship is narrow, is defined, I would say, by the jurisdiction of the doctor, for instance. The doctor has authority to order a nurse to do certain things related to the job that both are doing together, while in the case of the state, it's way much, the claim that the state makes on the citizen is way bigger and more comprehensive. So the state regulates our lives in all kinds of different aspects.
And on this point, I mean, because your approach is morality oriented,
yes.
So when you're talking about the state,
yes.
The question is the morality of the state. So could you be more specific on what the state authority transforms in our relationship to what we have to do?
Yes. So I think this is valid for very specific cases, like as I said before, a doctor or a nurse, or a teacher and a student, or a parent and a children, but also in the central case, the state and the citizen. The idea, I would say, is that the state, or the authority in general, requires that we do something, and by making this request, the authority creates a new duty. So the idea is, I have a duty to do something, X, whatever, just because someone who's an authority over me on this matter requested it.
Yeah.
So that's, and this is valid, as I said before, I think, for very specific cases, but also for the state. So when the state says we should do something, we should pay our taxes, or we should drive on the right, or we should do, I don't know, present all kinds of things. These are not just pieces of advice in a way, but these are moral requests, meaning that we are duty bound to do these things because the state presents itself as having the authority, the moral power to create these obligations. But of course, that raises the issue of what are the grounds for this? Because in the kind of the everyday cases, the doctor and the nurse, the teacher, etc., it is, perhaps there is some controversy, but it's quite straightforward. What are the grounds of the authority of the doctor, etc.? While in the case of the state, is more controversial, I would say, because we've been discussing this for in political philosophy since the beginning, I would say, since Plato, since the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. What are the groundings of the authority of the state? And there is kind of an intuitive response, which is, well, of course, we somehow gave the authority to the state, but it's not clear how this process took place, and even it's not clear whether it took place in the first place. So this, in the case of the authority of the state, is more controversial and more difficult. This is why I think many people today think that the state doesn't really have the authority that it says it has.
This is the position, for example, of philosophical anarchists.
Exactly. Philosophical anarchism is the thesis that, we citizens don't have political obligations there are two ways of understanding this claim. One is more like abstract or conceptual or a priori, meaning that it is impossible for us, autonomous and citizens, and rational citizens, to be bound by the authority of the state. But this is perhaps too strong a claim. The kind of a weaker claim is that it is possible, meaning, for instance, if we do consent to the authority of the state, therefore we acquire the obligation and there is nothing problematic about it, but it's not true that we do this. We didn't consent to the authority of the state, for instance. So in that respect, Locke and the social contract tradition in general are wrong, I think. Not in the sense of the the philosophical structure, but in the empirical aspect of the account.
You mean we never consented?
We didn't consent. Therefore, we are not bound because of our consent, because this didn't take place.
And is it the reason why, instead of relying on John Rawls' theory of justice, your main reference is Joseph Raz, and in particular the morality of freedom? Is it for that particular reason that you don't buy the conventionalist or contractualist theory, that you are so much referring to Joseph Raz, who is a very difficult author? So could you tell us more about your relationship to Raz and why you think it's important for us to read him?
Yes, I think that, first of all, I think Raz, he's an amazing philosopher. He's very abstract and very difficult to understand sometimes, but he's very, the points and the analysis that he provides are very compelling and very useful to understand different things. So in Raz's view, I would say there are two dimensions of authority. One is the conceptual aspect of it, namely how the requests, the commands, the orders that an authority give us affect our practical reasoning. So, and this is something that we can separate, I think, from the normative account that he gives of why an authority is morally justified. And he uses the idea of service. So a morally justified or legitimate authority provides a normative service, meaning it helps us to act as we should act anyway. So it's a kind of an instrument that is useful for our normative life, for discharging the duties that apply to us anyway. But I think the second aspect, the service conception, so-called, is very controversial, and in my particular view, is not the main or the most important resource that we have from Raz. What is more interesting, I think, is his analysis of how the claims made by an authority affect our reasoning. So we can use this thesis. Sometimes he calls this the preemption thesis, namely that authoritative commands preempt our practical reasoning.
That means exclude.
Exclude, yes.
Some other kinds of reasons
exactly.
that we may have to do such and such a thing.
Yeah, exactly. So he also uses the idea of exclusionary reasons in his previous works. So he uses different terminology, but I think the basic thought is always the same, namely that once we are required by an authority to act in a particular way, in a particular fashion, our thinking is changed, our deliberation is changed, or at least should be changed if we recognize the authority of the person or the institution that is making the request.
So you think he's right?
That respect,
on this point?
On this point, yes. And this is very useful, I think, because this is something that we can use to separate two dimensions of authority that normally are not properly distinguished, especially, I think, in the case of the state, which is the power, the normative power to give obligations, to impose new duties, and the power to coerce, to force our action via threats. So these two dimensions are different, I think, and it's useful to differentiate the two. While if we don't have this conceptual analysis of how the claims made by an authority function in our reasoning, it is not that easy to separate these two dimensions.
It's very interesting because everyone thinks, and listening at what you've just said, of Max Weber's definition of...
Everything is about power, about coercion, and this is the key.
And you don't understand what the legitimacy means in the definition.
Yes. Well, perhaps in the case of Weber, he has a sociological account of legitimacy or authority. So it all depends how people react or think about the authority. While Raz, or the philosophical discussion in general, is more focused on the normative claims that an authority makes, and therefore they make room, I think, for these two dimensions. But this is also something that we can see, I think, in everyday cases. So I will give you an example if you allow me.
Yes.
So for instance, I have a child and I want someone to take care of my child while I'm going to this party or something like this. So I hire someone to take care of my child. And I would say, by hiring this person, I authorize the person to give, to create new duties on my children, for instance. So if the person says, children, now it's time to go to bed, this is a duty that they have just because someone who's an authority in this respect is making the claim. But obviously, the person that I hired doesn't have the right to punish the children unless I somehow authorize that too. But this is a different thing. So we can see in cases like this that there are two things that are separated and different. One is the power to create obligations, the normative power to create obligations, and the other is the power to create or to impose sanctions. So this, even in these little cases, everyday cases, they are separated. And in the case of the state, perhaps it's more difficult because the state has also, or the three things perhaps, the normative power to create the obligations, the authority to impose sanctions to, and also the causal power to force the people to do the things that the state requires. But these are different dimensions. So the work made by Raz and many others, of course, but Raz is a central figure nevertheless, is, in my case, I think, very useful to understand these different dimensions and the different kind of requests or aspects of the authority of the state.
You published a book in New York a few years ago, in 2015, on Hobbes, and the title was Hobbes, Legal Authority and Political Obligation.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit more why Hobbes appeared to you, as you just explained to us, why, the reasons of your interest in authority? Why did Hobbes appear to you as a relevant choice?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, I think to begin with, so the short answer would be that I think there is intrinsic value in Hobbes. I think Hobbes is just the kind of work he did is very important for and it's just, that's just a reason to take proper care of it. But also, I think this goes back to the discussion that we just had, namely that the normal or the kind of the intuitive approach or reaction that we have to Hobbes is that Hobbes is all about power or all about coercion, and Leviathan as a figure has the power to force the people to comply, to force the people to obey the laws of nature that they are not sufficiently motivated to obey in the state of nature. So the kind of the initial reaction or the initial idea that we normally have of Hobbes, I think, is that Hobbes is all about coercion. So,
which is not your view.
It's not exactly. So it's not my view. I think that. So this is why I used Raz, for instance, to try to make sense of Hobbes. So Raz is a kind of a means to illuminate or to try to understand Hobbes, and especially the idea that the state is not just a coercive machine, but an entity that has a power to create obligations. And this is, for instance, this goes back to one idea that is very central in other writers like Locke, for instance, but also in Hobbes, that the state is a referee, an umpire, a person who makes these kind of decisions. It's not just about telling people, to forcing people what to do, but rather to deciding controversies about different points of view.
It's the impartiality view, which is behind this presentation of
Yes,
Hobbes.
yes. So this is something more intuitive, I think, or more prominent, perhaps, in Locke or in other writers from the social contract tradition, especially Locke, because the idea of an impartial judge, of this umpire, is very central to Locke. But also in Hobbes, I think, the idea of Leviathan as an empire is very crucial, is very central. So once we try to kind of make a very fine-grained analysis of these ideas and theses that are not perhaps properly separated, or they go together as the reader like analyzes the book. Once we try to understand and analyze these different ideas separated one from the other, it becomes more clear that there are different dimensions going on. One is the again, the normative power to impose obligations, and this is something that is crucial, I think, but also, of course, the capacity to create incentives via sanctions. So the things are connected, but they are not the same. So that's why I got interested in Hobbes. And also because Hobbes is so controversial and counterintuitive, I think. So normally...
Paradoxical, you would say?
Yes, perhaps, yes. But especially in the sense that this is... So he's in favor of absolute monarchy, for instance. And we are not, I would say. No one is really today in favor of these kind of ideas. Or it's not mainstream anyway. But Hobbes gives arguments for these theses. So it's interesting, I think, to try to see the reasoning behind the claim that he's making. So not to differentiate between the kind of the bold claims that he makes and the reasoning behind. And the reasoning is very subtle sometimes. And not only in the case of authority, but also in other aspects. For instance, he believes that contracts under coercion are morally binding, and this is something
which is really shocking for us today.
Yes, exactly. So this is something that we don't accept, but he thinks that there are reasons for this point. That is, it's not just a claim that he makes, but rather kind of a conclusion that follows from from different arguments that he gives. So this is something that is very controversial, but he, it's insofar as there are arguments behind, it is interesting and important in my view to try to understand the arguments and see where they go wrong, if they go wrong. I think they do, but it's not totally clear what is it that makes it go wrong.
And this brings us to a final question about the way, because your book is very interesting and fascinating to many, for many reasons, but one of the reasons I find it particularly stimulating is the fact that history is not at the center of your analysis. Hobbes is a 17th century philosopher, and you tend to deal with him just as if it was who had been writing his Leviathan 50 years ago. So could you explain us why you think it possible to address or to read an author like Hobbes with the tools of analytic philosophy?
Yes, well, I'll try to do my best. You know, there is this controversy, of course, between more historically oriented and more philosophically oriented approaches to these historic works. So, of course, Leviathan and the whole, all the books that he wrote are pieces of the history of political thought. They are not contemporary works. So he wrote them many, many years ago in a totally different context. And this is something that of course, we have to take into account. But this doesn't exhaust, in my view, the meaning of these works. So he's trying to make arguments, as I said before, for philosophical theses. He's not just saying this is a product of my circumstances or something like this. I'm just, fighting an intellectual war within this bigger context, which is perhaps the English Civil War or the events related to the English Civil War. He's also making philosophical points, philosophical arguments. So therefore, I think we are allowed to take these claims at face value in a way, and to try to understand these claims as they are presented to us, namely as theses that are supported by arguments, by reasons. And so this is my kind of first approach. But also I think that analytic philosophy applied to the history of political thought, it's a useful means. We, by using these resources that we have, we are allowed to see complicated things through lenses that make them less complicated somehow, or try to see the nuances between the different positions that are presented there. So in a way, I think my approach is, or my way of approaching these historical works is, well, on the one hand, we can take them as face value, as they are presented to us, but also it is, we have like instrumental reasons to read them via or with the help of modern contemporary political analytic philosophy in general, because we make them more interesting, more detailed, more compelling perhaps, and also the kind of the other side of the coin is, in the case of Hobbes, for instance, but not only, we have more resources to see where they go wrong. So I think this is kind of the idea. We have tools that allow us to understand these works and also to see where they go wrong.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.